be talking about the history of Nantucket Sound, historical aspects of the sound, including maritime commerce, transportation, and the Kennedy's family's ties to the sound. First, Greg Ketchen, a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain. He's president of the Coast Guard Heritage Museum right here in Barnstable. During his 27 years as a Coast Guard officer, he performed many roles, including running the service's search and rescue policies. Greg's going to discuss the history and causes of shipwrecks in the Sound, marine emergency response efforts, the origin of the Coast Guard's search and rescue mission. Our second presenter is Wendy Northcross. She's the executive director of the JFK Hyannis Museum, which she co-founded in 1991. Prior to this, she served as the CEO of the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce for 24 years and the Hyannis Area Chamber for 8 years. Wendy holds seats on several boards. She served in leadership roles in professional and community organizations, promoting economic development and tourism. And Wendy will be discussing, as I said, the Kennedy family and their love of the Sound. And finally, we have Elizabeth York, the executive director of the Cape Cod Maritime Museum in Hyannis. Having grown up in Massachusetts, Elizabeth's life has always been influenced by the water and our oceans. Elizabeth will speak about the history and design of steamboats and transportation, a lifeline here for the Cape and Islands and Nantucket Sound since the early 19th century. So please welcome Greg, Wendy, and Elizabeth.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's September, and it's really bananas at the JFK Hyannis Museum. It's nice to see people out and about and enjoying Cape Cod, but I feel very lucky to be here. So thank you. So I am, as Peter said, I am a co-founder of the JFK Hyannis Museum. It was in my role as executive director at the Hyannis Area Chamber in the late 80s that we recognized everybody from around the world still wanted to come to Cape Cod and see something about the Kennedys. In fact, they wanted to tour the Kennedy compound, which unfortunately we had to explain to people then, as we still do, they still live there. It's not open for tours. Unless you happen to have run across Rose Kennedy walking the neighborhood. She was famous for just inviting people in to see the house and to entertain people. But for the most part, the curiosity about our place and about the president has not waned, and so we still try to manage that curiosity. The focus of our museum is the Cape Cod story. We are not the presidential library, although we work closely with them in Boston, and we have a rich catalog of photography and video. President Kennedy was the most photographed man to become president at that time. He was very adept with the media because he was trained to do that as a child. His father actually bought all the kids movie cameras and made them take movies of each other so that they would be very comfortable in front of the camera, and especially movies. But so part of the story that we tell is how the Kennedys came to even be on Cape Cod. And Joe Kennedy, who we call the ambassador, and Rose Kennedy, born and raised in Boston. And Joe was a very astute business person, amassing a fortune. He wanted to do what every other wealthy Bostonian family did, which was take your children out of the city for the summer for recreation and health. And he tried a few seacoast communities and really liked Cohasset, just south of Boston. He decided to join the golf club there, and they just did not act on his application. It wasn't blackballed, they just tabled it. Do you have any idea why? Irish, Catholic, new money, and he was a Democrat. So they finally came to the Cape. He had been brought here as a young child. They came to the Cape and rented the Malcolm Cottage in Hyannisport for several summers until Rose Kennedy deemed it was good. She used to dress the kids alike so she could keep track of them. The family was growing when they bought the cottage. I don't think Ted was born yet. No, Ted wasn't born yet. But they immediately expanded the size of the cottage to make sure there were 9 bathrooms. We had 9 kids, 9 bathrooms. I think that made it work. But they came back every single summer from the mid-1920s. We're coming up on a century of having the Kennedys as our neighbors. The focus of the time that they spent here was really driven by the father. It was to be athletic, it was to be aggressive, it was to be with a winning mentality. There was no room for second place in his family, and it was to be on the water. In fact, they chose Hyannis Port because it had a yacht club, and Ambassador Joe Kennedy wanted the kids to learn how to sail because he did not have that opportunity. He ended up buying a lot of big motorboats and motorcraft, but his sailing was not a core skill. But as you can imagine, all the siblings took like ducks to a water. They adored being on the water, to the point of they were on the water whether it was good weather or bad weather, and they became very competitive on the water, sailing. Here's JFK teaching his younger brother, Teddy, to sail. Teddy always emulated, he adored his older brothers and wanted to be exactly like them. But they spent an inordinate amount of time on the water. The sea had such an influence on the Kennedys that Joe Jr., JFK, and then Bobby all joined the Navy. And they were very proud of their naval service. This is JFK in his Navy whites. Today, it was kind of a fun day. We had about 8 seamen who are assigned to the aircraft carrier under construction, named for the president. It was supposed to be done during the pandemic and has been delayed, but they recruit sailors and then they bring them to Boston and to the Cape to understand the person for whom their ship is named, and it was really fun serving them today and showing them. I was proudly showing them the picture of Bobby being sworn in at the age of 18 into the Navy. And of course, Joe Jr. Lost his life in service to our nation. He was killed in action during World War II. So as the president became president, as John F. Kennedy picked up the mantle from his fallen oldest brother, who the father had designs that he should become president, JFK said, all right, I will pick up that mantle. I will pursue a political career, which he did in rapid fashion. We then became on the map. Once JFK was elected president, that's when our lives changed on Cape Cod. And that's part of the story that we tell at the museum. But it was really a lot of fun in those 60s when the president would come helicoptering in, land on his father's front yard. The moms would make sure the kids were out of school if they knew the president was coming in on a Friday afternoon. They just wanted to see who he was bringing with him and who else was on the compound at the time. This was a fun picture that we have currently up of John Glenn water skiing with Jackie. She did a better job than he did of water skiing. And they spent a lot of time on the water. JFK would bring dignitaries out onto his father's motorcraft, or they would just be swimming and sailing. We'd pack those little Hyannis seniors with more people than probably should be in them, just to be out on the water. And he was doing business out on the water, but it was through the enjoyment of the water. You can go ahead. Caroline Kennedy tells stories of her dad talking about a shark that likes to eat white socks. And he would take socks off of people and throw them overboard and then throw Caroline overboard. She seemed to have survived okay, but it was a fond memory that she has. They were all about boats, big boats, little boats, power boats, didn't matter. Little tiny boats. They had probably a whole navy themselves. We have had fun with some of those boats. Of course, Victoria, the actual wooden Hyannis Senior, lives in Boston, although it spends its winters getting rehabbed here in Osterville. But this is once President Kennedy became president, he had his choice of all these former presidential yachts or watercraft, but he passed on the 172-foot steel schooners that he thought were too pretentious, like the Britannia. He preferred instead the 92-foot power cruiser from the Eisenhower administration, and he renamed it for his grandfather, Honey Fitz. So he would use it for state occasions and official duties, but he was always at heart a sailing skipper. The Honey Fitz made an appearance here in Hyannis Harbor in August of 2013, and it was still magnificent then. It was a real treat to be on that. But another boat that he took over for his own use was a Naval Academy racing yawl named the Manitou, and there's a lot of famous pictures of him behind this giant wheel, and that, in fact, was the Manitou. He sailed that to Maine, I believe. But it really kind of didn't matter. As long as they were on the water, they had Extreme weather racing was a famous sport, and even JFK Jr., Senator Ted Kennedy shared a letter that JFK Jr. had written to his uncle complaining about being made to go out and race on a Thanksgiving Day in this horrific weather. I said, can we have a copy of that letter? We didn't get a copy. But so, as I said, JFK was an avid sailor. This is him sailing in his Hyannis. I try to tell people this is not a sailboat race. You'd have to throw half the people overboard to win anything in that race, but it was a great time for the family to be together. JFK, I love this picture. We just got rights to use it for a couple of years. The photographer is David Zing. He moved to Brazil. We had to buy rights from the Brazilian Institute of Photography and Culture. Where was the photographer when this picture was taken? I'd just like to know. Must have been hanging on for dear life. But the Kennedy brothers especially were known for their sailing prowess, but Eunice was extremely aggressive, and there's some really fun stories about Eunice falling overboard and telling her brothers, just keep going, come back around and get me, you got to win the race. So after the president's death, the Victoria stayed in the family. They finally, I believe, there's other people that know better, but they commissioned a fiberglass version of the Victoria, and you can see Victoria, too, sailing the local waters today. Maya is another famous boat of the Kennedys. This was Ted Kennedy's favorite. This is a painting or a crayon coloring that he did of his boat, and he gifted this to the museum. I'll never forget watching, glued to the TV the day of his funeral, and there was this, we actually saw the caravan leaving the Cape, going to Boston. They flew to D.C. They buried the senator, and the whole family came home that night and went sailing on the Maya. The Glide just had a 75th birthday. The Maxwell Kennedy invited us to the birthday party. You get a nice little present too, Elizabeth, at that day. That was fun. Who has a birthday party for their boats, the Kennedys? Anyway, I think the last slide didn't make it, but it's a beautiful aerial view of Cape and Islands in the winter, and it is a very special place. And the Kennedys, I think their philosophy about environmental preservation, certainly the creation of the National Seashore, was always shaped by and influenced by their love of the sea. Certainly their public service was too, and we have all benefited from that. So the point I like to make is that it's nice to have influential people in high places that appreciate the ocean and do important things for us, like Rob O'Leary. And thank you.
Okay, hi folks. My name is Elizabeth York. I am the executive director of the Cape Cod Maritime Museum, and I'm going to be talking briefly about moving people across the Sound, especially on the steamboats and the ferries that we would see. So it's probably no surprise to anybody out there that before steamboats made it to the Sound, that the main method of conveyance across Nantucket Sound was by sail power. No surprise there. The main two methods of conveyance with sail power were usually schooners and sloops that would be called packets and coasters. Now, packets were vessels that would normally be responsible for transporting passengers, as well as a little bit of cargo. They'd be transporting their passengers on a semi-regular basis. I say semi-regular because with sail power, you're still dependent on the tides and the wind. So they would be carrying cargo from port to port, but not in bulk. Coasters were sailing vessels that would carry mostly cargo and occasionally passengers. And I say occasionally passengers because they did not operate on a regular schedule. Those packets did, but not the coasters. They were very, again, tide and wind dependent, so there was no kind of known date when they would arrive. So at this point, the method of travel was very reliant on the wind and tide and would often cause delays in travel. And frankly, these irregularities were accepted as quite normal. And they were highly tolerated. At this point, there wasn't even the conception of steam power to propel a boat yet. So the idea of regular and reliable services to the islands from the mainland of Cape Cod or New Bedford wasn't really even considered yet. So a little bit about history of steam power. While steam power was being used commercially around the world by the mid-1700s, it had yet been used to propel a boat on water. Robert Fulton built the first successful commercial steamer called the Clermont in 1807, and this traveled from New York City to Albany. And interestingly, a round trip from New York City to Albany on the Claremont at this point in 1807 was 4 days. So you can tell how primitive it was by that point. So the years 1807 to about 1820 were characterized historically as a sort of experimental days in steam travel. The popularity and reliability had still yet to grow because by this point, steam travel on boats like this was still kind of a little bit dangerous. It was still, you see those auxiliary sails all the way at the stern there. It was very reliant on wind still because they were very low powered. But the ability to have reliable transportation that could operate on a schedule, that became popular. People wanted that reliability of the schedule. So now, as steamboats became more popular, they explored lots of routes, like the Long Island, New York through Long Island Sound all the way up to Fall River. They also started to explore Nantucket Sound, and this really helped connect Cape Cod to the islands in terms of tourism and the whaling economy. So it was around the 1830s that the islanders began to understand the importance of steam travel because of that reliability and that ability for these boats to arrive on schedule, because they normally departed at the same time, at the right time, and they normally arrived at the right time instead of having wind and weather delays. So 1818, just 10 years after the Fulton's first steamer that we saw in the last slide, the Claremont, the vessel Eagle made its first trip on Nantucket Sound. This was the first steam vessel seen on Nantucket Sound. This was between New Bedford and Nantucket. Many of the passengers aboard were Quakers on their way to a meeting on the island. The second trip, the return trip from Nantucket, was 2 weeks later. Anyone want to guess how long the trip took? Audience participate? 2 weeks. Not 2 weeks, no. The trip from Nantucket to New Bedford was 8 hours and 7 minutes. So at this point, on the island of Nantucket, the whaling economy was really thriving. So the trade in and out of the island, especially trade in and out with a reliable schedule, was really popular. People loved that aspect. So you can see how steam power kind of was necessary out there. But interestingly, it kind of didn't work. Martha's Vineyard, I'm not forgetting about it, also had its own ventures into whaling, but was not on the same scale of Nantucket. So people on the island were not fully convinced of steam power yet. I mean, remember, we're a region of wind-powered sailors. We're not sort of steam sailors yet, or we're not steamboaters yet. So they weren't fully convinced of this, but it was that reliability that made that reputation grow. So on the top here, we've got the Telegraph. She was 120 feet. She was one of the first successful commercial ventures of steam-powered travel on Nantucket. In previous years, I mentioned that it didn't really work on Nantucket. There were other companies that tried steam travel. They tried to be commercially successful, and most often they were only a few months out. Some of them would even close down after a few weeks. So people weren't fully convinced until the Telegraph. She made the trip, her first trip from Nantucket to Nantucket from New Bedford in 1832, and by a year later, her owners had incorporated the Nantucket Steamboat Company. Nantucket Steamboat Company, in anticipation of an increase in business, built the Massachusetts, seen here on the bottom. That was 1842, so just 10 years later. She was built at a cost of $39,130, and yes, I did the math today and figured out what that would be in today's money, and it's $1.4 million. So she was much larger and faster than the Telegraph. She was known and very well considered to be the finest vessel on Nantucket Sound. So in 1854, the company put her on the the Hyannis to Nantucket route, as the rail line from Boston had just been extended to Hyannis. And this allowed passengers to have a shorter at-sea route to Nantucket than the New Bedford to Nantucket route could provide, which those who get seasick quite easily, I'm sure, appreciated that. In 1848, another thing that I find kind of cool, the rate of passage from Nantucket to New Bedford and vice versa was $2 a trip. Meals were usually about 50 cents extra. In today's money, that's $75 per trip, so a round trip of $150, and $18.75 for food. It's not bad, but $150 for a round trip back and forth. So I haven't forgotten about Martha's Vineyard. Not all of this is about Nantucket. So the steamer Naushon made her first trip to Edgartown in 1846 for the newly formed New Bedford and Martha's Vineyard Steamboat Company. She was the first steamer to operate on a schedule to the vineyard and was put in service expressly to serve the vineyard. The Naushon would stop at both Vineyard Haven, which was then called Holmes Hole, and Edgartown, and she was stopping there 4 days a week, which is a pretty good schedule for that time. Another thing to note historically about Nantucket, shifting back to Nantucket, is that in the 1840s, they had a fire that was really devastating to their waterfront. And this was also around the same time that the whaling business was really making a market shift to New Bedford. So there was hard times. There was an economic decline on the island. Nantucket was going through hard times. So it was around this time, the 1850s, that they were trying to market the island as a great place to vacation, a great place to visit, marketing it more as a summer resort in hopes of bringing that economy back, even though it wasn't the whaling economy. One of my favorite steamers that plied Nantucket Sound is the Island Home. So she was built in 1855. She was built by the Nantucket and Cape Cod Steamboat Company. She was 184 feet. She traveled the Hyannis to Nantucket route. And by 1860, as Martha's Vineyard had become a much more popular destination for excursions and for the Methodist camp meetings, there would be hundreds and eventually thousands traveling to both islands. Where the Methodist camp meetings were, there's a great image there on the bottom. That is now Oak Bluffs. So responding to the popularity of Martha's Vineyard as a great sort of daytime visit and weekly vacation visit destination, the line that was running the Island Home ended up extending her route to go from Hyannis to Nantucket to Martha's Vineyard on that sort of triangle route. Now, unfortunately, in 1872, unfortunate for Hyannis, when the railroad line was extended down to Woods Hole, they ceased Hyannis's use as a terminus, especially to the island of Martha's Vineyard, because again, that at-sea route to the vineyard from Woods Hole was much shorter than it was from Hyannis. So this really helped decrease the journey time at sea and was really popular with voyagers. So as the vineyard began to grow in popularity, we come to the 1920s. This is the Great White Fleet. So I like to think, so these were steamers built in the 1920s. I like to think that they pulled this name from the World War I battleships, but I think they really pulled it from how beautiful these ships are with their white paint scheme. So the first built for the company was the Islander, seen here in the top-hand image. She was built and launched in 1923. She had beautiful, smooth, clean lines, a pointed bow, and a bellied-out midsection. I'm not body-shaming this boat. The citizens of Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and mainland Cape Cod considered her to be incredibly modern for the time. She was sleek, she was stylish. People were really proud to see her out on the water. Now, she could accommodate 2,000 passengers. Now, that vessel Eagle that I showed you right at the beginning, that made the 8-hour and 7-minute journey between New Bedford and Nantucket, that could only hold 60 passengers. So within a span of 100 years, there's a necessity for vessels to carry 2,000 passengers versus 60. So you can see that boom in people going to the islands and cargo going to the islands. In 1924, the company ordered a second steamer, seen here on the bottom. She was ordered to be an exact replica of the Islander. This is the Nobska. So the third built, and this was the third built in the same decade, which is another testimony to the increase in tourism and visitors and residents alike traveling back and forth between mainland and the islands. The third built for the line was the New Bedford. She joined the fleet in 1928. And at this point, the New Bedford, with the name New Bedford, the other two vessels that we saw before, the Islander and the Nobska, were renamed Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. So we've got New Bedford, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. Finally, in 1929, the company introduced the Noshon, seen here at the bottom. She was the largest boat on the run, and she was, again, the fourth boat built for the company within that decade. She was a twin propeller boat compared to her three older sisters, which were single screw, single propeller boats. And she was also one deck higher than her three older sisters. So while she followed the basic design concept, she was much larger. She was a little bit faster at sea. So the Great White Fleet boats were really a new class of steamers on Nantucket Sound and vessels on Nantucket Sound. They were incredibly recognizable. They were popular. And they were the easiest way to serve the islands. So at this point, both islands and Cape Cod had a solid reputation as being delightful places to visit, delightful places to vacation. Even if it was just for a weekend, these vessels allowed for that. And for many people, a weekend was the best choice because you had to go back to work by Monday. So interestingly, my favorite fact about the Great White Fleet, in 1930, so we're talking the very, very beginning of the Great Depression, in order to save money, The company painted all 4 vessels in the Great White Fleet gray. And this was done in order to cut down on having to paint over the rust and dirt and other sort of algae accumulation. Now, you can imagine everyone was real mad about that because the thing that made these boats so beautiful was that white paint scheme, their recognizability out on the water. And the press got wind of this, and by the next year, all 4 vessels were repainted white. After World War II, the company was sold to the Massachusetts Steamship Line for $750,000, which I believe in today's money was something close to $14 million. So this is about 1946. The Islanders were hopeful. Inflation is kind of crazy when you do math. Anyways, the Islanders at this point were hopeful that with the takeover from the Massachusetts Steamship Line that there would be an improvement in service. So after World War II, both the Noshon and the New Bedford were taken by the U.S. government for use during World War II as troop transports, and they did not return to the line. So by this point, the line only had Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard to use. And so you can imagine that there was a lot of frustration because of that constraining schedule that these 2 vessels versus 4, plus the overcrowding of passengers and cargo. So people were kind of pretty mad that there wasn't a lot of vessels, there wasn't a lot of access, and it was a constraining schedule. So the Massachusetts Steamship Line brought this boat to the line, this one that we see here. It was originally named the Hackensack because it was a ferry that was used on the Hudson River by the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was a double-ended car ferry, so you can see vastly different from what one of those Great White Fleet vessels we saw before, kind of short. Doesn't look like it has great passenger accommodations, if any. It looks very cargo-based. So they renamed it the Islander, but she was commonly known as the Hack. 1947, the Massachusetts Steamship Lines purchased a Navy LSM, which is a landing ship of medium size. They had it converted for passenger use. It was greatly disliked by the general public because, as you can imagine, a former Navy ship had very, very crude passenger accommodations, and it was very rough at sea. And the things didn't get better for Massachusetts Steamship Line and for the Islanders when the company suggested that they wanted to curtail their daily service to both of the islands, operating on an every other day basis. So public indignation was at its highest at this point. So high that the government had to get involved. Representative Joseph Sylvia of Martha's Vineyard submitted a bill calling for the immediate investigation of steamboat service to the islands. A commission was soon established, and after that investigation, it was stated that it was obvious that a private entity could not properly and profitably serve the islands on a year-round basis. So they really messed up, that Massachusetts Steamship Line group. So as a result of their findings, a state authority was established on June 11th, 1948. After nearly a year of negotiations and then transfer of property, the line was taken over by the now named New Bedford, Woods Hole, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket Steamship Authority. The authority was comprised of 5 members, 1 from each community that the line served, so 1 from each town. And then the 5th person was a member selected at random by a governor, so pretty cool, by the governor. Now, to make things easier for all of us, I'm just going to call it the Steamship Authority or the Authority because I'm not saying all of New Bedford, et cetera, 12 more times. So the Steamship Authority, while legally guaranteed protection on Nantucket Sound from competition from larger vessels, it was not protected from competition from smaller craft. So the Hyannis steamship lines was running from Hyannis to Nantucket, and they were transporting only passengers. In their first year of business in 1946, they transported 15,000 passengers throughout the year to the islands. Their second year in business, 25,000 visitors. The great advantage of smaller lines like this is that they didn't have to operate year-round. So the moment that the summertime visitors and that summertime crush, those busy summer months, died down, they could close down for the season. While the Authority was left to run throughout the colder and very often profitless months of winter. So the first order of business for the Authority was to build a new vessel, specifically to replace the outdated and very disliked Hack. This is the vessel here, named the Islander. She was designed specifically for service to the Vineyard. She was designed to be a workhorse for the line and designed to be durable, economical, functional, and capable of decades of use. So in 1961, the Authority was reorganized and renamed the Woods Hole, Martha's Vineyard, and Nantucket Steamship Authority. New Bedford was dropped as a terminus because it was simply too far away to warrant the expense of running a vessel out of. It was around 1933 that Hyannis was reinstated as a terminus for the Authority. This helped ease the crush of passengers, cars, cargo, freight that was all going in and out of Woods Hole. You can imagine how crowded and crazy it would have been there, especially in the summer months. And it also provided Nantucket residents with a shorter at-sea route again, and it provided them access to the commercial shopping, the now starting to boom commercial shopping and professional services of the Mid-Cape. So the Steamship Authority currently operates 10 vessels that carry passengers, automobile, and freight trucks. Now, I'd be completely remiss if I didn't talk about Highline Cruises, because from my office window, I can see them leaving every day, right on schedule, as always. Brothers Richard and Robert Scudder founded Hyannis Harbor Tours Incorporated along with E. Raymond Taylor in 1962. With John F. Kennedy's election in 1960, there was a lot of local demand in seeing and viewing the homes in the Kennedy compound, and what better way to do that than from the water. So the brothers purchased a piece of land at the north end of Ocean Street in Hyannis, the north end of Ocean Street docks in Hyannis, and with this, they entered the marine sightseeing business. So they saw an advertisement in local papers that listed the 150-passenger vessel Prudence for sale, and they moved to purchase her. The Prudence started out on sightseeing tours and proved to be incredibly successful. The brothers contracted a boat to run seasonally to the Vineyard in 1970, and then in 1971, they launched their own boat, the East Chop. In 1972, Hyannis Harbor Tours bought out Nantucket Boat Company, and with it, they acquired 3 of their 5 vessels, their docking facility, ticket office, parking lots, and the trade name Highline, but Highline with an I. And they renamed it the Highline, Highline with a Y. Throughout the years, they expanded their services to include inter-island service and first-class traveling options to Nantucket. In 1996, they introduced the first high-speed ferry service to Nantucket Sound, and by 2005, they were operating their high-speed service to the Vineyard. Thousands and thousands and thousands of visitors to the islands and residents alike have traveled on Highline cruises every year, and Highline's economic impact on the Cape is very much a driving force for what we do today. So the story of the steamers, as I wrap up here, is one of evolution and development, in my opinion, not only in the design and propulsion methods, which I don't really have time to get into today, but if you want to know more, I'm happy to talk about it. But it's also a story of evolution and development of our region's culture and international visibility. From yesteryear to today, the ferries and the boats on the Sound have served as the main lifeline to the islands. They've served as the main connector for visitors and residents alike. And thankfully, they still continue to serve that purpose today. Thank you.
My topic today will be about maritime commerce and transit. I'll get into a little shipwrecks and a few things like that related to it, but mostly I'm going to be talking about the traffic coming through the Cape in the beginning of the 1700s and 1800s. Well, actually, we go back to the Pilgrims. As you know, they were dissuaded from coming onto the shoals when they saw them, and got diverted to Provincetown and eventually to Plymouth because of the dangers that were presented by Nantucket shoals. About 6 years later, the Sparrowhawk came over, smaller vessel, only 25, I think, on board, and encountered the shoals too. Finally, ran the vessel aground in Orleans and was recovered, frankly, about a little over 100 years ago, and still exists in a warehouse up in Plymouth. But actually, the Sparrow, just to touch on shipwrecks again, as far as we know, the Sparrowhawk was the first shipwreck in the United States or in North America that was documented, at least. Fortunately, it wasn't tragic. No one was lost on it. People spent the winter in Plymouth with the Pilgrims and eventually got down to their destination down further south. So I'm going to be talking about mostly movement of goods, but also movement of people, and sort of using what Wendy and Elizabeth just talked about. The Sound has been important for recreation, certainly recently, as accentuated or highlighted by what the Kennedys were using it for, and certainly transportation over to Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket was an important part of it. But there are also vessels coming through quite often. In fact, it was America's first interstate highway system. It wasn't paved roads as Eisenhower did in the 50s. This was maritime, and it was moving all sorts of goods, moving ice from Maine, lumber, ice from Tudor Wharf, finished products, raw goods, bringing products back up to New England, for example, coal and other products, eventually oil coming up to Maine and so forth, heating oil. There's a lot of traffic going on during the time. In fact, just to go way ahead, I'm going to be talking earlier than this, but just as an example, by 1902, they counted 50,000 ships came by Pollock's Rip, which is right at the entrance to Nantucket Sound. This, by the way, the big blue star there is where we are right now. But textiles, manufactured goods, eventually more sophisticated goods, watches, things are being produced in New England at the mills and the manufacturing was coming by here. It was a treacherous area. It was navigation was in a poor state at that point. We had even celestial navigation Harrison hadn't developed the chronometer at that point, so longitude was sort of a guess. You had a pretty idea of latitude where you were, but longitude didn't know where you were. So that led to a lot of shipwrecks where people didn't know they'd come too far and had run into the shore eventually. Then they knew where they were. But the navigation was also hampered by the weather in here. We're all familiar with that. What's just happened the last few weeks with weather, hurricanes and nor'easters that come through. When you're on a power vessel and you have good GPS navigation, it's not as much of an issue as when you're on a sailing ship, not knowing where you are, trying to get along the coastline. Particularly, I'll just give one quick example, particularly if you're sailing up on the outer cape and the wind is coming out of the northeast, classic nor'easter. The problem there is that when you're on a square rigger coming up, you can't go into this wind as much as you can with a sloop or some other staysail. So you get pushed into shore more, and that's why we have so many shipwrecks. People didn't quite make it all the way up to the northern tip of Cape Cod and got driven ashore south of by Truro and so forth. A lot of shipwrecks there. In fact, I should mention, there are, by our count, in excess of 3,000 shipwrecks that have occurred since the 1600s along Cape Cod. And that's inaccurate. There are probably many more than that, because ships went ashore, were lost. The Cape wasn't very populated then, and all the families knew is they left maybe Salem going to the Far East and didn't come home. They don't know whether they were lost off Cape Cod or at the southern tip of South America. But there were, let's leave it with many ships that were lost. So there was a need to have better navigation. And the first steps were to have lighthouses. The first lighthouse was Boston Light in Boston Harbor in 1716. This was Cape Cod Light, now known as Highland Light. It was built just prior to, right at the end of Washington's first administration. It was put up, and it served as a beacon to guide people along the coast a little bit, particularly that traffic moving up and down from ports in New England to New York, Savannah, Baltimore, those areas. Obviously one of our famous lights here, and I will give a little Coast Guard history. Coast Guard, the Boston Light and lighthouses and age navigation is part of our history. This is the Nantucket Sound showing some of the bathymetry. The blue are shallower areas on Nantucket Sound. Those are being to be avoided by larger vessels. You can see if you don't have any navigation, that can be pretty tricky. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a circle around a point. I'll get back to that spot. It was kind of the entrance to Nantucket Sound, particularly treacherous. But there's a very rich history, both good and bad history, related to Nantucket Sound. I'll go back here for a second to this picture I had on before. Most vessels in the day would try to avoid going through the Nantucket Sound until they got better navigation, and would avoid cutting through there. Too many accidents, so they'd go down around Nantucket shoals. But that was particularly dangerous too. You had a number of things were working against you. The shoals were always moving because of the weather, so you're not sure where the shallow water was. It was a longer trip to go all the way down. So there was incentive to cut through Nantucket Sound, and as we're getting better navigation, they did cut through. And again, looking at this thing, you can see some of the challenges involved. Let me give one example of a shipwreck. The schooner Wyoming was the largest wooden sailing ship ever built. 450 feet, 22 sails on it. It sank off Pollock Rip in 1924, sailing. It was on its way from Norfolk to the Maritime provinces with a cargo of coal. It was thought to have broken, actually. The thought is that a large wave came in, and it got between the two crests of the wave and came down and broke its back. Everyone on board was lost. We're not quite sure what exactly happened with it. But the other problem we have in Nantucket Sound, Nantucket Shoals, is fog. Fog was, I've heard some statistics say that about 40% of the time Nantucket Shoals is covered by fog. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but certainly it's a foggy area, which makes navigation difficult, particularly if you're still using celestial navigation or line of sight. Understand that most of Nantucket Shoals, and I know we're focusing on a sound right now, but that most of the shoals are beyond any navigational aids that would normally exist. Thus, we came to the next evolution, light ships. Light ships are just floating lighthouses, essentially, in areas where you can't build a lighthouse, or in many cases it's too dangerous to build a lighthouse. One quick example there is the lighthouse off of Cohasset that was everyone on board was lost because of a storm. They put a light ship there for a while, then finally built the current lighthouse off Cohasset. The first light ship in Nantucket Sound was in 1938. It was a cross-rip light ship. First year it was open, they had 14,000 ships pass by that location. So it was an active area. People are starting to get more confident to move through the Sound. The light ship had been used before in other places. In fact, the first light ships in the United States were in the 20s down in the approach to New York, Ambrose, and approaches to Norfolk. But basically, Nantucket Sound was one of the first couple decades of light ships that are coming in here. There were so many light ships. Well, let me go first to this drawing. This shows a little bit more the topography going into Nantucket Sound. It's hard to see here, but marking this channel going in are, if I'm counting right, about 5 light ships. It was a treacherous area to get through. Handkerchief Shoals was just off the southern tip of Monomoy Island. Handkerchief Shoals was significant. Well, frankly, the story of why it's named Handkerchief, frankly, it was sort of shaped like a handkerchief, and people said that it was named that because the sailors leaving their girlfriends and wives were crying as they left the port, or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the wives were crying when their husbands left. I think it's the other way. The husbands were crying and the wives maybe were cheering, saying, "Come back, see you in a year or two." But this Handkerchief Shoals is an example of one of the many light ships. There were a total of 16 light ships at one point scattered around the harbor. Not all of them at one time. I think the maximum was 9. They moved them around some and put them in different locations. But it was known as Light Ship Alley. You can see some of the light ships, not the Nantucket. Nantucket's outside of here because Nantucket was 40 miles south of, Nantucket Light Ship 40 miles south of the island. But it was one of the most dangerous jobs, believe it or not, that the Coast Guard or any of the original organizations that made up the Coast Guard, Lighthouse Service or the Revenue Cutter Service or the Life-Saving Service had was surviving being on light ships. First of all, just to transfer on, the light ships would stay out there without power, I should say. They didn't have any generators, so they'd be tied up there for a year or two at a time. The crews would be changed every couple of weeks, transferring from the vessel that was doing the transportation back and forth to shore was challenging. Then tragically, every once in a while, you'd lose a light ship. Someone would run over it, storm would take it out, and it was a very dangerous occupation. I'll give one example of that. It's a light ship that would have been visible from where we're sitting here. It was called Cross-Rip Shoals, just to the south of here, about 15 or 20 miles. It was out there from in 1918. Some of you may not understand some of the early history of the environment here on Nantucket Sound too, about ice in the wintertime. At times, the whole sound would freeze over. You could, if you were brave enough, theoretically, walk across. Well, this vessel, the light ship at this particular location, was caught in the ice. The captain knew that I'm in trouble. It's middle of the wintertime. The ice moves around a lot. I can appreciate the wind working on ice is a lot of force, and it's moving against it, and it crushes ships. There was so much ice out there that he was actually able to walk ashore from his ice ship to Nantucket and communicated with his superiors up in Boston and said, "We need to evacuate." And his superiors at that point, I should say this before they became part of the Coast Guard, the Lighthouse Service said, no, we don't abandon our ships. You stay there. Well, tragically, a month or so later, the ship was crushed. Everyone aboard was lost. It drifted out to sea, and that was the end of that lightship for that period. Another one was built, but there were 6 crew on board that were lost. So it was dangerous, to say the least. Nantucket lightship, shown, if you can see it on here, you get some idea of the distance offshore from that little red arrow down the far right corner is where the lightship was. A famous history, and again, some of it is good, some of it's bad. It was there from just before the Civil War, and finally was the last lightship to exist. It was decommissioned in 1983. We have 3 people involved with our museum that were on the Nantucket lightship, one of the other lightships that still tell stories about their experience. It was important, particularly for transatlantic shipping, vessels coming over from Europe. You've heard of the Andrea Doria disaster and others where they're trying to get around there. That's what they're avoiding. But there was a tragic accident involving a ship. This was the Olympic. The Olympic was a sister ship of the Titanic, identical to the Titanic, same size, built the same time. Survived about 22 years longer, or a little more than about 25 years longer than a Titanic. It was making regular transatlantic crossings. Coming by the lightship. This is a picture taken by one of the people on the lightship when it came by a few months before tragedy. It was heading into New York. One of its next transits, I think, it came and ran over the Nantucket lightship and killed 7 of the 11 crew on board were killed. Frankly, the people on board didn't even know they had hit something. It was such a large ship. The size difference between the lightship and the Olympic was so significant. Anyway, there are a lot of other stories with Nantucket. I'll tell another one. The first time it was out there, those first years in the mid-1800s, it drifted off station. At one point, it could drifted off so far, understand, it didn't have power. It drifted over to Montauk and went ashore there and was badly damaged. They finally repaired it. Another time where they had some sail power at least, they drifted off and ended up down by Bermuda and had to come back, sail back up north. So it wasn't very comfortable. It wasn't very boring. In fact, they filled times making things like lightship baskets, for example, in the late 1800s. Let me continue on here. By the way, the characteristic, by the 1930s, the characteristic colors for the lightship finally became red with white lettering. So obviously Nantucket lightship had Nantucket on the side. Some people don't realize that there was many more than just one. This is over a 100-year period that Nantucket lightship was out. So if someone says, I've seen a Nantucket lightship, well, there are still 4 or 5 that survive of the old ones. There's also a relief lightship, was the one every once in a while, every couple of years, another ship would go out and take the place of the one that had to go into the yard, and it was called the relief lightship, standing that station. Then ultimately what happened is that they're replaced by, in this case, what we call a Texas Tower, essentially. This was Ambrose Light going into New York, replaced by, that lightship was replaced by this tower. Those are all gone now too, and frankly, many of these things are unnecessary today with global navigation, GPS and satellite navigation. If you're very interested in lightships, there are several. There's on YouTube. You just look on YouTube. There's Lost Sentinels of Nantucket Sound, and it talks about that. A good video. There's also several books on Nantucket Sound lightships. I've just touched on some of the stories that are really fascinating. But I want to touch on one other thing. When we're talking about moving people, I said it wasn't just a moving of people from Cape Cod over to the islands. It was also moving people through Nantucket Sound. There were passenger vessels that came out of Boston and other areas to the north that would go south to New York and so forth. But one particular vessel kind of indicates what the trip was about. These trips were about. City of Columbus in the late 1800s was operating a service running from Boston to Savannah, Georgia. I think it was a week trip. Maybe it was a week turnaround. They'd go down. It was a power vessel. It had sails, but basically a power vessel. The crew on board were Cape Codders, basically. The captain and the officers on board were Cape Codders. Very familiar. They'd done this trip literally hundreds of times. They knew the area very, very well. It was 275 feet, typically would carry 150 to 170 people. But their trip, they left from Boston in February of 1884, departed from Boston, and the line that you see there, this shows the attended track line that came down from Boston and coming through Nantucket Sound, and they didn't quite make it past Martha's Vineyard. They got off course. They hit the ominously called Devil's Ledge off of Gay Head, and tried to back off the ledge, which was a bad news because that they were already badly holed. So that just brought water on faster. It had 132 people on board, and only 22, I think, survived. Only a little over 100 survived. The tragedy there is all the women on shore, and it was packed with families going down to spend the last part of the wintertime with families down in Savannah. All the women on Trolden died. They died, it sounds really hard, and many of the crew and males on board did survive, but because all the women and children were brought out on deck to get into the life rafts, and at that moment, when they're all ready to do that, a big wave came through and washed them all over the side. This was one of the larger disasters until the Titanic for the East Coast. It was a major disaster, and it's an interesting story, but this is where I get to a little bit of Coast Guard history. This particular painting was done by one of the officers on the Dexter, which is a revenue cutter. Revenue cutter was returning from patrol. I won't go through the history of the Coast Guard, but basically in the early 20th century, the Revenue Cutter Service, the U.S. Life Saving Service, and the Lighthouse Service merged to become the Coast Guard. That's when the name was adopted, actually in 1915. This particular image showing the city of Columbus going down shows the U.S. Life Saving Service, or part of Mass Humane Society, which became the U.S. Life Saving Service, and the Dexter Revenue Cutter, and the Lighthouse on Gay's Head. Those are the three organizations that became the Coast Guard. This was before they were Coast Guard, so it was for me a very appropriate painting to have. We use it quite often at the museum. Next slide, though, is coming forward a little bit. Some of you may remember this. The tanker Argo Merchant in the 1970s ran aground. It was in terrible shape. It shouldn't have been at sea. Many of the people on board were not qualified. Coast Guard took a little bit of a beating that they didn't have in there for not having better inspection of this vessel. It just slipped through for whatever reason. It got off south of Nantucket and ran aground and was starting to break apart. It had 7.7 million gallons of fuel on board. There was a crew of 38 on board. They all got off, which was fine. But the vessel broke apart, and all the oil was discharged. Just by the grace of God or Mother Nature, or we believe, the wind for those 2 or 3 days was blowing from the northwest offshore. All that oil moved out. Now, it certainly did some environmental damage out there, but it was dispersed in the ocean, and minimal environmental damage compared to what would have happened if it had been a wind from the south. We would have still probably had tar balls out here on the beach today. It was very lucky. Put it in perspective, the Exxon Valdez was about 4 or 5 times more oil that went out. That was a big oil spill. And of course, the Deepwater Horizon outdid everything. Deepwater Horizon, one in the Gulf of Mexico, was about 20 times larger than this one out here. But we got lucky. It doesn't say that it can't happen again. It can. But there are better regulations now, double-hulled and so forth, and better navigation. But again, things can happen. Just point out 2 recent ones. I'll start at the bottom first. The Royal Majesty in 1995, over 1,500 people on board, ran aground just off of Nantucket. This was not in the Sound. Frankly, the big cruise ships the big ones aren't coming in here because the depth of water isn't bad. You get cruise ships over in Martha's Vineyard, every once in a while, a smaller one will come into Nantucket. But the big cruise ships, this was one, the Royal Majesty is the one that was working between Bermuda and Boston. There was also one from Bermuda to New York. And it had some very sophisticated navigational equipment on board. It was very modern. In 1995, all sorts of computer screens up and new, but something happened with one of the leads coming down from the Loran system and the satellite system to computer, and the computer started to second guess the people weren't enough to double check the computer. Computer was what they call dead reckoning. It was predicting by our speed and the course you're steering, we should be going this direction, and the wind was pushing it off to the west. It was coming back from Bermuda, and it ran aground, hard aground. Fortunately, it was sand. It wasn't particularly rough out there. It took a while to get off there, but my point with that is complacency. You can become too dependent on things. You don't check. Well, a very close friend of mine who was the commander up at the Marine Safety Office in Providence was assigned to fly out there and do an investigation whether they're still aground, which he did. They discovered the electronic link and the problems with it, and that was fine. No one was injured. They were lost a couple weeks of this cruise time, which cost them quite a bit of time. They had to go into the yard, but nothing significant. But as he was interviewed by the press, this is a guy named Captain Turlow. After he went through everything, he said, they were within sight of Martha's Vineyard, the lighthouse on Martha's Vineyard. I'm on Nantucket, sorry, on the eastern shore of Nantucket. And he said, sort of coyly, every once in a while when you're navigating a ship, you need to look out the window. The lighthouse is right there. I missed that. The INO is a different situation. Again, complacency. Understand that this is a fantastic vessel. The crew, the captains on board, extremely experienced, very knowledgeable. But I would argue, and this is not the official Coast Guard view, but I would argue that it's another example of some complacency. They had great equipment on board, great navigational equipment, but they were thrown off by a little bit of low visibility and some additional lights are out there and went aground. It was sad. I mean, obviously, it was a freak event, I think, but navigation is not perfect, and ships still go aground, or there are dangers with it. The most recent example, this was probably a poor example, is what happened with a submersible. The oceans are unforgiving. When you put something in the ocean, humans are not intended to be living in this environment on the ocean. It's a harsh environment, and evidenced by just in the last 20 years. I could point to other shipwrecks that have occurred very recently too. They still happen. Fortunately, nothing really significant in Nantucket Sound recently, and there are a lot of regulations to protect it. I will just say one last thing, or two things I'll say, correcting Peter, or adding to Peter, my introduction. My background, my graduate work was in oceanography, so tides and currents were my specialty. And also I spent 5 years as the director at the New England Aquarium. So my love of the ocean and the environment is solid. And I share your concern for the sound, and however I can help, I will. But I also want to do a little advertising. The three of us represent three museums on Cape Cod. Obviously, the JFK Museum, the Maritime Museum, and the Coast Guard Museum. We're part of a larger network of museums that is called the Museum Trail. Believe it or not, there are 75 museums that are part of the Museum Trail, all on Cape Cod, with one exception. The Nantucket Historical Society Museum is part of ours. All nonprofit with one exception, too. That's the Woodha Museum. Happens to be for profit. Good museum, too. But visit us. Spread the word. We're there. We would love to tell you stories. There's so many stories. All of us have just shared a little bit of the stories that our exhibits show. Shipwrecks, 3,000 shipwrecks. We can go through each one of them if you'd like. But there are all sorts of tragic stories and stories of rescue, such as the Pendleton and the Finest Hour, that rescue. With that note, we're going to see if anyone has any questions.
You mentioned that the lightships were moved around
Yes.
often in Nantucket Sound. How would the mariners know the new positions of those?
Well, to clarify that a little bit, the Nantucket lightship, for example, wasn't moved to another location, such as Cross Rips with Nantucket written on the side. But some of the lightships were moved. For example, several lightships up here in Nantucket Sound had been lightships down off New Jersey and were moved up here. That time they're repainted and so forth. So they replaced ones that were more aging. The relief lightship was the exception. The relief lightship went out, said relief on the side. People understood. One part of the problem, I don't want to digress too far here, part of the problem with navigation, and Three Sisters is an example of this up off Nauset. When you're coming ashore and you don't have good navigation, you don't know which lighthouse you're looking at. You see Three Sisters that existed, obviously, as most of you are aware, replaced by the Nauset light. You saw three lights there, and so, that's Three Sisters. I know where I am now. The same with lighthouses or lightships. Unless it's written on the side, you don't know if you're coming into a lightship Nantucket or whether you're further north coming in the one at Pollock's Rip or whatever. So there were, that's why the bold lettering is side. I will add, too, in later years, the lightships had what are called radio direction finders on them. they would broadcast a signal. So vessels coming across the Atlantic would drive in on this signal. That's what happened to the Nantucket lightship. It had the signal there. They drove in, didn't turn, and ran right over the top of it. They were coming in a steady bearing, tragically. Identifying the aids navigation is important. And if a vessel was, what I meant by different positions is that they would take the Pollock Rip light and move it to another location after it had been there for 5 or 6 years as the sand shifted. And they would put broadcasts out to mariners so they understood that it was in a new position now, for example.
Are any of the lightships available now, any of the remaining ones available for touring or as a museum?
Well, that's a good question. They've moved around so much. There used to be one up in Boston. When I was at the aquarium, we were looking at bringing one in there to have there permanently, but they're obviously very expensive to maintain. There's one being used as a bed and breakfast. There on the West Coast, there's one out in Astoria that's at the museum there, but I don't know one right now that you can get on board. There were 116 lighthouse stations over the years, but almost all the lighthouses were scrapped. So I suspect the lightships that still exist, I meant lightships before, the lightships that still exist, there may only be a couple dozen left and scattered all over the country. I'm not quite sure where they are. Yeah.
I had a friend, Billy Golden. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Former state senator.
Yeah.
He bought the Nantucket lightship, he told me, on eBay.
Yep, he did. That's true.
And he used it as a wedding. They used to do weddings on it and sort of events. It sometimes shows up in Vineyard Haven or church.
Yeah, you're right. He did. He famously redid the thing. Very nice. It was used to bed and breakfast too. It was a great. And when he said I have the Nantucket lightship, as I mentioned earlier, there were several, probably over the years, 7 or 8 Nantucket lightships, many of which, such as the one run over by the Olympic, aren't around anymore. The picture I showed here of the Nantucket lightship was the one that replaced the one that was run over by the Olympic. It was purchased by White Lines by the British. They obviously felt very sorry about running over a lightship and killing 7 people. They were seriously very concerned about that, so they actually funded a new lightship. That didn't pay for the lives lost, but at least it got us a new lightship back. But yes, he did have. It was in Boston for quite a while too. Oh yeah, it was in great shape. The problem with the lightships, and any ship, frankly, and Elizabeth can speak to this from Maritime Museum, extremely expensive to maintain. When we were doing the research, I was looking at bringing one to New England Aquarium. It was going to be $100,000 a year at least to have that vessel there. By the time you pay for some staff, by the time you pay for the periodic every other year going into the yard and so forth, easily $100,000. And this was 20 years ago, so it's probably more now. These historic vessels are becoming fewer and far between. My concern, let me digress a little bit to come on a different topic. One of the vessels we have here in the Cape is the 36-500, which was the famous vessel that was used for the rescue of the Pendleton. We have a very enthusiastic group of people that are maintaining it, but they're all aging out. Our concern is that that's maintained because they do a very good job. Those who have seen that vessel, they do a very good job, that 36-footer, maintaining it. But is our next generation going to care for it? The same is true with light ships. Is the next generation going to be able to keep them in good shape?
So yes, they're quite expensive to maintain. Wood, steel, fiberglass, doesn't matter. Very expensive, but pretty fun museums, I will say, from experience.
It's not just the nor'easter. One of the more famous storms that occurred was the Portland storm. It was named the Portland storm because the vessel had sank with all 400 people on board. Everyone was lost, just north of Cape Cod. These storms are dangerous. We've lost so many Cape Codders with storms. Fortunately, most of it have been off Cape rather than in Nantucket Sound, but on Nantucket Sound too.
Greg, I don't know if you would know this. My ancestor actually died in that lighthouse, Joseph Antone. The light Lynx 143, which everyone on the South Shore likes to think is "I love you." Yeah. Do you know any history on that?
It is true. I don't know the name per se. Yeah. The lightkeeper at the time was on shore, so his crew was out there, and this was a skeleton lighthouse. If you can picture, the idea was, well, a skeleton lighthouse, the waves will just break through it. There's no chance of it being taken out. It won't be any force. Well, it didn't work. It was lost. in a storm. Waves broke over the top. It was only up for a short period. It was only a couple of years before it was lost with everyone that was out there at the time. What happened then they got the lightship in there, but then they built the one that exists now is a granite lightship. Precisely, if you've ever been out there and near it, very precisely built. In fact, they built it on shore first. They constructed a whole lighthouse on shore, make sure everything worked. Then they took it out there. It was our first lighthouse that was built in open water. There's a little bit of shoal area there. At low tide, you can see some rocks, but it was open water. It was the approaches to Boston Harbor. It was a light that was leading you into the Boston Light and so forth. But it was a tragic. Now, I had command of what's called Group Boston at times. So that was one of my lighthouses, why I know it so well, and have spent quite a bit of time, or been out there several times. We have occasions where waves will come in and still break over the top of the lighthouse. It's a pretty good-sized lighthouse. I forget exactly the height of it. But in February, I think it was February, it's probably 1995, we had a big storm that came through, broke over the top. At that point, the lighthouse had been automated, and there were solar panels up there that were powering the light. These waves were breaking over the top and took out the solar panels and took out not the lens up there, but no power for the light. At my operations center, I got all sorts of calls from people. I understood the I love you light, but this happened to be, you probably understand a little bit, February 14th of that year. People are coming to reaffirm their vows, or coming from Buffalo and coming from all over the country, or we're going to propose propose marriage to their girlfriend, and the light was out, and they called and said, "How can your light be out?" And we explained this. It was all covered with ice, and they're all understanding. They understood that we're not going to risk a life to go out there, but they're quite disappointed that they weren't there to celebrate their anniversary or to do something on Valentine's Day by this "I love you" light. As she said, you may have heard. Every lighthouse, Boston Light, for example, flashes every 10 seconds. As I mentioned about Three Sisters, there are 3 lights that are just spaced there, we're spaced there, and other characteristics, 2 lights up in Maine, 2 lights there to identify it. But the one off Cohasset flashed one flash, and then 4 flashes, then 3 flashes. And it didn't take long before he said, "Oh, that spells I love you, 1, 4, 3." So if you're in trouble with your spouse of some sort and want to take them up to Cohasset, that's a good place to reaffirm your vows.
Our family tales say that Joseph was speaking to his wife, and that's how he communicated to her.
I think it was probably that way before, but I'm not sure what the characteristics are. They may have changed them when they put the stone tower up. I'm not sure. The other tower was there, so this is all just prior to the mid 1800s, 1850s, 1840s. I forget exactly when that was taken out.
I think you said that the Pilgrims were advised to avoid the shoals, and that's how they wound up in Provincetown. But who advised them, and how did they know that?
Well, they approached the shore. Well, it's a little bit. I mean, these legend has it that they approached, and there's several vessels that come in here without. Again, longitude was a problem. So they're coming across, and first thing they come into, if it's a storm, is breaking waves in the shoal area. But you want to add more to that?
No, they had been at sea for so long, and it was a gruesome passage. And they approached the shoals, kind of knew where they were. They were headed for Virginia or Hudson River, so they kind of went back and forth, and finally just kept. I don't know whether the tides took them towards Provincetown. They got around the corner and they said, "We're just stopping here." So they got out. And you know why Monday is wash day in New England? It's the first thing they did. That was the first day they were on land, and they did the laundry.